right, we're going to get this started. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here today. Dr. Karen Fingerman, unfortunately, is sick, and she's not able to join us today. So I'll have the honor to introduce Dr. Audrey Duarte to this year's 2024 UT Excellence in Research on Aging lecture, which is hosted by the Texas Aging and Longevity Center and co-sponsored by the Center on Aging and Population Sciences, with funding also provided by the generous support of St. David's Healthcare and the David and Cindy Eigen family. Okay, so a little bit about Audrey. She has a huge CV, so I'll just give a brief summary of her. So she received her bachelor's degree in neurobiology, physiology, and behavior from UC Davis, and her PhD in neurobiology from UC Berkeley, from which she then went on to complete her postdoctoral training in cognitive neuroscience at the Medical Research Council in Cambridge, United Kingdom. So her work focuses on understanding neural changes that underlie age-related decline in episodic memory, and understanding why some people age better from a neural and cognitive perspective than others, and to develop and implement effective interventions to alleviate decline. She also has long-standing and active interdisciplinary collaborations with neurologists, neuropsychologists, and sleep disorder clinicians, and with mechanical engineers to investigate experimental manipulations that may ameliorate episodic memory impairments in people with Alzheimer's disease pathology, and to explore sleep-related biomarkers of Alzheimer's disease pathology. She also has a particular interest in the cognitive neuroscience of aging in racial ethnic minorities and the psychosocial factors like race-related stress, depression, and acculturation that influence memory and underlying brain functions in diverse populations. And so each year, the Texas Aging and Longevity Center provides the Excellence in Research on Aging Award and a special lecture to someone whose research is distinguished and widely recognized, and which we think would be of interest to the community as well. So on behalf of the Texas Aging and Longevity Center, we are very thrilled to present Audrey Duarte with the award this year. Audrey, would you come and take your award? There you go. I don't know if there's pictures. Congratulations. And so with that, Dr. Duarte is going to present on memory and the brain across the adult lifespan in underrepresented populations. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Oh my gosh. I was telling Liz, I'm deeply uncomfortable with people looking at me. And I have seen my face come up in email. I mean, as you all have, I'm just horrified the number of times. So thank you so much for coming. I'm so honored. Truly to be given this opportunity. So let's get into it. Okay, so typically episodic memory shows decline across the adult lifespan, and this is kind of a general pattern across the decades. I'll define episodic memory, which we can define many ways, but I'll define it as long-term memory for personally experienced events. So remembering what you had for dinner last night, who was there, that sort of thing. This is largely the kind of cognition and memory we study in my lab. So in the real world, there are many examples of common episodic memory failures that we all experience. So forgetting where you parked your car in the parking lot, not that you parked your car in the lot, but where you parked it. That's an example of what we typically see declining with age. Remembering someone's name is a common episodic memory impairment, as is remembering the dates of important events. So we all experience these impairments, failures. They're common, but they do become more frequent as we age, even in what we would call cognitively unimpaired aging without any signs of dementia. So a few years, some years ago now, oh God, time is compressed as you age. Some of my colleagues and I, we wrote this review where we talked about well-known individual differences in cognitive aging. So it isn't every single older person shows these kinds of impairments. There's large heterogeneity. So this is from a study from Batula, or the Batula study in Sweden, I should say. And it's just a composite cognitive performance score. What's clear is that more of the people in the lower performing and tend to be older, but there are people, older folks, 75, who are performing on par with people in their 30s. So well-known individual differences, but what's underlying those individual differences, that's the million-dollar question, right? So we proposed these models, and we talked about various factors that underlie individual differences in cognitive aging, some of those being malleable ones. And those malleable ones, potentially malleable, those are the ones that we like to explore in my lab. Genes are a little harder to manipulate. So things like life stress, discrimination-related stress, acculturation, sleep, which is potentially malleable, sleep health, physical activity, and mood. So I'm going to talk about this a lot, as you can tell by the title, but I'm a cognitive neuroscientist, and I study aging. And in my research field, but this is well known in many research fields, there's a real underrepresentation problem in our human samples. So a few years back, my colleague Vanetta Dotson and I, we wrote this review where we documented the different demographics of papers in the literature. And most of the papers didn't report these demographics like sex, race, ethnicity, and socioeconomic status. And of those that did, there was not very good representation in the samples. So we assume that most of those that didn't, which was the majority, also had pretty underrepresentative samples, largely non-Hispanic white samples. So this is a problem. I mean, that was our argument. This is a problem. And it's a problem for many reasons. So one is generalizability. So do the factors, and I'll stick with cognitive aging as my example, because that's what I'm going to talk about. Do risk factors, for example, for cognitive decline, things that we know in the typical samples that we've studied, the non-Hispanic white samples, things like education are associated with cognitive, or protection against cognitive decline. Does that also protect against cognitive decline in people regardless of their race and ethnicity? We don't know. So things like, so for example, years of education may not be that predictive. Quality of education may be a better predictor. And so people are, exploring this very question. As an example, I'll talk about, tau pathology here. So tau pathology is one of the pathologies of Alzheimer's disease and other dementias also. And we know from many studies that greater level of this pathology in the brain, tau, is associated with worse cognitive performance. So you can see that here in this Caucasian non-Hispanic white sample. And these are older people. However, we see that relationship is much attenuated in the African-American older people that were included in this study. I'm not showing this here, but so this was a bit of a surprising finding, right? This is important because tau and amyloid also are the pathologies that are the primary targets of pharmaceutical medications. There is no cure for Alzheimer's disease, but there are many, I don't know how many millions of billions, I don't know, many dollars spent on the development of these drugs, but almost everything we know about Alzheimer's disease is from pretty biased, not representative samples. So not shown here, that's what I was going to say. Cognitive dysfunction in the African-American sample was better predicted by white matter hyperintensities, and that's something I'm going to return to later. So different kinds of predictive factors for different groups might be something we need to explore. Another reason why representation is important is related to this study-to-study variations in subject demographics across research studies might contribute to this low reproducibility problem, which in psychology, I'll just take psychology as an example, just to beat up on my own field, we talk about this reproducibility crisis. I don't know if people are aware of this discussion, but there are a lot of findings that don't seem to replicate. There are a lot of reasons for those, and this is sort of a scientists in the field reporting whether they think, yes, this is a problem or not, and most do. So one issue that we propose, or something we proposed in that review was that part of this reproducibility problem might be due to the differing demographics across samples and not looking at those different demographic variables. as related to the data. And then, of course, there are changing demographics. So the US population is becoming increasingly diverse, and this is projections from the US Census. If you want to be able to understand cognitive aging, cognitive decline in a way that's applicable to the general population, we need to think about better representation in our samples. So before moving on, I just want to make clear how we think about race and ethnicity. I say we, I mean, in my lab, but how people in the field think about race and ethnicity too. So race is a socio-political construct that divides people according to perceived physical differences. And ethnicity reflects things like culture, geographic differences, and language differences, amongst other things. And there's general agreement that race and ethnicity are proxies for many factors, psychosocial factors that I'll talk about, some economic factors, and structural factors, things like access to healthcare and education quality. So in the work that's being done in our lab and others too, we assess these social determinants to understand the contributors and the moderators of race and ethnic group differences in cognitive aging. So I'm going to go into an area of research that we explore, which is related to sleep. And a question that we're interested in, which is, does poor habitual sleep, which is related to poor habitual sleep and aging, and whether this negatively impacts episodic memory performance, which you might think, oh yes, obviously, I don't know what you think, but there's a lot of literature linking memory and sleep. But we actually don't know a lot about whether poor sleep in aging contributes to declines in memory in aging, which is kind of crazy. But this is a relatively new area of research. So this is typical patterns. This is total sleep time in minutes and minutes of time spent awake after falling asleep. And there are these typical age-related patterns where we spend less time. This is, I don't know if you can see the numbers, but actually I can't see them either. Oh, I still can't see them from here. But I think we're going to like 95 here. So we spend less time asleep and more minutes waking after we fall asleep. And this is typical even without a diagnosed sleep disorder. Subjective reports, up to 70% of older adults report sleep disturbances. So this is a really, really common problem in aging. So in my lab, we've done a lot of work in this area. We did a meta-analysis, my former student Emily Hawkett, and we found that the relationship between sleep and memory is actually equal, similar across younger adults and older adults. But what we don't know about is this relationship between sleep and memory in racial and ethnic minorities, because just under either reporting or people didn't measure those demographics, or more likely underrepresentation in the samples in that meta-analysis. So we know from public health research, of which there's quite a lot, that there are well-known sleep disparities in historically minoritized people. And so this is from self-reports of sleep. Very short sleep is sleeping less than 5 hours on average a night. And you see these again, are self-reports, but these disparities where Black, African-American, and Mexican-American, well, not Mexican-American participants, actually, there's a longer sleep in this group. I'll just mention something here, which I'm not going to talk about again, but the relationship between sleep time and health and cognition is somewhat of an inverted U. So very short sleep and very long sleep have both been associated with negative health outcomes. So it's not like everything's maybe going great here. Just want to make that point. Objective sleep we can measure many ways. I'll talk about that. But one method is called actigraphy, which you might even have this method built into your smartwatch. It's using gyroscopes and devices to monitor movements throughout the day and night. And this is a way to tell us how much a person is sleeping, whether their sleep is broken, if they're restless during their sleep. And with this method too, we see these group differences where there's a greater odds of poor sleep quality in these racial, ethnic minority groups. So as related to cognitive decline, we know from some research that poor sleep is predictive of later Alzheimer's disease diagnosis. There are many predictors of Alzheimer's disease. poor sleep may be one of those. So this is a study where at baseline, these older people who had no cognitive impairments were divided into highly fragmented sleepers and minimally fragmented sleepers based on their actigraphy responses. And the people who were highly fragmented, kind of restless throughout the night, were more likely to be diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease and at a faster rate over a period of 6 years than those that were minimally fragmented sleepers. However, this was not a diverse sample. And some of you may be aware of this, but the percentage of people with Alzheimer's disease in the United States and the world, but in the US, is going to increase as in the coming years. It's coming quickly. And the prevalence of Alzheimer's disease diagnosis differs between racial and ethnic groups. So African Americans and Hispanics are more likely to be diagnosed. And that's now, but that's going to be larger numbers over the coming years if we look at these projections here. So understanding potentially malleable factors like sleep and how to do something about poor sleep could be very important for halting or slowing cognitive decline in Alzheimer's disease. So this is my former student, Emily. And she was interested in exploring this relationship between sleep and episodic memory across the adult lifespan in diverse people. In these studies, they're mostly Black Americans. So a couple of questions she was interested in exploring were to what extent poor sleep quality contributes to the effects of age on episodic memory and the neural mechanisms supporting episodic memory. And what is the impact of poor sleep in historically minoritized adults on episodic memory functioning? This is the details of the procedure. I'll just kind of give you I was going to say Reader's Digest version, but I don't know if half of the audience knows what Reader's Digest is. I do, because I remember it. But basically, people come in, and we monitor their sleep using these actigraphy monitors for about a week, I guess. And we ask them to perform a memory task in the lab, kind of a typical remember these words over a couple of days, and then they come back and we ask them what they remember. And all the while we're recording neural activity using a method called electroencephalography, or EEG. Sometimes people refer to this as brain waves, but we don't call it that. But people call it that. And so we're recording EEG while people are learning and when they're recovering memories. And I'll bring that back. I'll mention that again. So here are results. So this is showing average sleep time, and we're seeing typical patterns that have been shown in the literature. And this is, now here I will mention, I'm collapsing across our racial and ethnic minority groups. Most of the participants in here are Black Americans, but not that, we're not collapsing, we're collapsed for the sake of statistical power. This is kind of a pilot study, but not because we think all the groups are equivalent. They differ in many ways. Just want to make that clear. So we see this typical pattern of lower average sleep time in the racial and ethnic minorities across age, young, middle-aged, and older adults, than our non-Hispanic whites, and lower sleep stability. And we measure this as, how stable is your sleep night to night? So you might have 5 hours one night, or 6 hours another night, or maybe you have a restless night or a good night, and that kind of variability is actually also predictive of worse cognitive outcomes. There's less research on that, but we've shown that. So variability and averages are both important. This is showing the relationship between memory performance, where a higher number is better, and sleep stability, low is worse. And we see there's a negative relationship, particularly in the older adults. So lower sleep stability is associated with worse memory performance. And this was across groups. So I'll talk a bit about the neural mechanisms of memory now, and there are many, but theories of memory suggest that successful episodic memory is somewhat dependent upon what we call the reinstatement or the similarity of neural activity that we experience when we're learning and when we recover memories. So you might have heard of something like, if you study in this kind of room and then you take a test in the same kind of room, your memory is going to be better, you're going to do better on the test. It's that idea, but with neural activity. And so we looked at this kind of similarity in neural activity using our EEG activity that we measured from people's scalps, using these EEG caps. And we just correlate the neural activity and frequency or voltage between learning phase, encoding phase, and the recovery phase. And usually, a higher correlation in that similarity is associated with better memory performance. So that's our neural mechanism that we're exploring here. And what we found, this interesting difference between our racial ethnic groups. So we find here that low sleep stability is associated with a higher neural similarity signal, but only for this, what we call familiarity-based neural similarity measure. So that, I'll mention this too, so this is important, is only in our racial and ethnic minority group. If we look over here, this is across groups, but we see that low sleep stability, more variable sleep, is associated with a lower recollection-based neural signal. So familiarity is a kind of memory. We experience this too. So recognizing someone, let's say at HEB, but not being able to place where you know them from. That happens, when you have students, like not you guys, my class students. It happens all the time, right? So it's like, oh, you're familiar, but I can't place where I know you from. Recollection is, this is the kind of memory that helps us differentiate one event from another. So remembering exactly where you parked the car today, so you don't have to wander up and down the levels of the garage. Not that I've ever had to do that, mind you, but. So putting this together, and this is a tentative explanation because we didn't go in predicting this pattern, but what we're tentatively suggesting is that more variable sleep quality which we find in the racial and ethnic minority group to a greater extent, is associated with a reliance on this less effective familiarity-based type of memory and less of the recollection-based type of memory. So we've conducted this preliminary moderated mediation analyses. Just to, there's a lot going on in here, but essentially what we are finding is that the relationships between sleep and the neural mechanisms that support memory and the relationships between neural activity supporting memory and memory performance are stronger in the racial and ethnic minority groups. We also find this age moderation. So even across people, when you're older, it does seem like sleep health, sleep quality may be a more important predictor of memory performance. So we're calling these kind of patterns double jeopardy. I'm going to use that term again. A double jeopardy effect in which increasing age and being from a historically minoritized group can increase the extent to which habitual sleep quality impacts episodic memory performance. So we've recently replicated this double jeopardy pattern in middle-aged and older adults where we find that worse sleep quality, so poor sleep quality, is associated with worse memory retention, a different kind of task, different population of people in Black participants than non-Hispanic white participants. So the big question we have is why do we see this double jeopardy effect in this minoritized population? And one possibility is that poor sleep is indicative of the presence of other memory-impairing factors, perhaps acting synergistically with those factors. And as an example, one of those factors, a psychosocial factor, could be race-related stress. So this data are from our study, and it's from a measure called the Index of Race-Related Stress, where people are given these statements and they're asked to rate them on a Likert scale. So example statements include, you have been subjected, I don't know where it's better to be, you have been subjected to racist jokes by whites, non-blacks in positions of authority, and you did not protest for fear they might have held it against you. And you notice that when Black people are killed by the police, the media informs the public of the victim's criminal record, or negative information in their background suggesting they got what they deserved. So the stronger people rate those statements, the worse their sleep. And that was true across our Black and non-Hispanic white participants. You might wonder how the non-Hispanic white participants are filling out this questionnaire, but actually it's if a person, regardless of their demographics, has a loved one or like a close family member that is Black, they can, and they feel appropriate to do so, they can fill out the survey too. So that's why everybody's on there. Other factors which we didn't explore in the study could include things like respiratory diseases, vascular diseases, and we are now exploring more of those in our current work. So, everything isn't negative. I always like to try to say something positive, We've recently been exploring lifestyle factors that often differ between racial and ethnic groups that might buffer against some of these racial sleep disparities. And one of those is religiosity. We've also looked at social support, which is related to religiosity, actually. But we have people, again, like on a scale, answer questions about how often do you attend church or other religious meetings? And there's also private religiosity. So in my life, I experience the presence of the divine. So it's not all, going to church every day or every week. It's just however people feel they are on a religiosity kind of scale. And so what we find here, and this is in Black participants from another study, that worse sleep quality is associated with greater race-related stress. That's not we already know that, okay? But that high levels of religiosity seem to attenuate that negative relationship between poor sleep and race-related stress. So we didn't measure this specifically, but we know from other research that religiosity is associated with better emotion regulation. And so we speculate that better emotion regulation in these participants may be buffering against some of the negative consequences of race-related stress on sleep and perhaps other health outcomes too. So actigraphy is great. We use it all the time in the lab. It's very easy. You just give people a watch. It lasts for like 30 days, and they kind of forget that they're wearing, well, I think they do. That's what they wear them. And we can reach a lot of people. But there are some problems with it. So actigraphy may overestimate total sleep time. It actually is well known to do this. So if somebody is lying still and not sleeping, the algorithm may detect that as sleep. And we also know from self-reported sleep, and we also use this measure in our studies, and some of those data I showed you, the last one, the religiosity data set was self-reported sleep, that there are racial and ethnic minority differences and age-related differences in how we perceive our sleep, or how we say we perceive it. Older adults and racial and ethnic minority participants tend to overestimate their sleep quality and quantity. That's problematic, right? So they're good methods, they can reach a lot of people, but they have these flaws. Now, the gold standard in sleep medicine and sleep research is to measure neural activity while people are sleeping. Maybe some of you have had one of these studies, or you've gone to a sleep clinic or something. They put EEG electrodes on you. They're measuring respiration and movements of your body. And this method is called polysomnography. This is great. It can measure the neural architecture of sleep. That's what we call it. We can measure all of these, these are in frequency space, this neural activity coming from your scalp, or coming from your brain, through, just to be clear, from your brain, and we're measuring it at the level, at the scalp. But we can look at the data and identify these different neural measures, sleep spindles and these slow oscillations. And we know from many, many studies, rodent model work, studies in humans, that these signals play a really important role in memory consolidation, which sleep is very important for consolidating memories. Okay, so polysomnography, this neural activity is really the gold standard and is important for identifying targets for therapies. So how it's typically measured, if you haven't seen it, is you like this. So a person goes to the lab, a sleep lab, and or a research lab or a clinic, and they're wired up with all of these electrodes, and then we say night night, and then please sleep now. There are mobile systems too. So this you can take home, and we can record neural activity while you sleep. But I think, as you can see, these are not great, right? They're cumbersome. I mean, although you could sleep at home with this, ostensibly you can, it's bulky, there are hard components, wires come loose when people are moving around and such. So with a collaborator of mine, Dr. Hong Yo from Georgia Tech, he's a mechanical engineer, I think, which Liz referenced earlier, we've created this device, which is this wearable electronic system that measures EEG while people are sleeping. And this is one of our participants who's putting the mask on at home. We give them to them. We can mail them to our participants. And these are, it's just adhesive. It's like a medical grade silicone that you can put on and pull off, kind of like fabric, like Band-Aid like material, but less sticky. But they stay on, I mean, through many prototypes, now they stay on. And these are gold printed electrodes, so they're really flexible. You can twist it like this, and people wear this and they can sleep more comfortably. There are no wires, anything like that. So here's our participant again. He's operating the app. So we developed an app that people can operate on a tablet that we give them. And then they go to sleep, and there's wireless transmission via Bluetooth of their neural activity. And we're really proud of this, but we have here, in black is the neural activity during these there are different stages of sleep, non-REM and REM stages. And black traces are the gold standard polysomnography, all that wire stuff, that's the black traces. And the red is our system. And if you just kind of look, squint even, I think you can see they look pretty similar, right? And they are very similar. So we're getting very high accuracy in our ability to stage sleep, to measure different neural signals, high agreement. I know there's a lot here, just for anyone who's like a sleep person, here it all is for you. But we're really excited about this. So this was obtained, most of this was obtained from the lab. We have people in the lab, polysomnography, and our device. But we've been deploying this at home and wrapping up a lot of that, actually. So we have several goals with this sleep monitoring system. So one thing is we want to overcome existing limitations in sleep monitoring. It's a really low-cost system to develop. Polysomnography systems are expensive. $10,000 up to $20,000. The environmental impact is low because we can recycle the components. So we send the devices back to our collaborator, they recycle the components, and they give us new ones. And they're accessible. We can mail them to people. And that's important for where we're going, where we're trying to enroll large, diverse adult lifespan samples, people who may live farther away or may not be able to take off work. It's very hard, for example, to recruit middle-aged people in particular, or sometimes people from minoritized groups who have trouble getting to us with transportation. There are lots of reasons. So we're really excited about the accessibility component of it too. In our new work that we're doing and future work, we're enrolling these diverse samples. We want to identify features of the neural architecture that we measure during sleep that might predict memory ability and memory decline. So we're longitudinally going to be tracking people over several years. If we can measure something in the neural activity at time 0, and then a few years later predict which of those aspects of neural activity during sleep predict cognitive impairment, then we might have some potential targets of future interventions. And there are a lot of potential ways to intervene, brain stimulation, in addition to pharmaceutical kind of intervention. Yeah. So I'm going to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of the work that we're doing in depression across the adult lifespan. So older people have a higher prevalence of what's called subthreshold depression. This is depression below diagnostic criteria for major depression, even though major depression is less common in older people. And so older adults, when they do present with depressive symptoms, they don't always look like what you see in younger adults. So they might present with more somatic, like bodily symptoms, symptoms of fatigue, than mood-related symptoms, and that could contribute to underdiagnosis in older people, actually. Sometimes they can be dismissed as complainers, and that happens. Older adults with depressive symptoms are at a greater risk of cognitive decline. That's been shown in prior studies. But what we don't know are what the mechanisms are of cognitive impairment and depression across the adult lifespan. Depression across the adult lifespan has not been studied nearly enough. So in the clinic and in our research, we use subjective measures of depression. And this is a typical scale. This is one we use, and we like it for a few reasons. But we give people these statements, and you just respond on a, you can see it here, right? So you just, I could not get going. I felt like a bad person. A higher score is a higher level of depression severity. And we like this because this has been validated across different racial and ethnic groups, and because we can identify different symptom clusters, some more somatic symptoms or more mood-like symptoms, using this particular measure, the CESDR. So in some recent meta-analyses from my lab and from Vanetta Dotson's lab, who is my collaborator, one of my collaborators on this new project, we estimated the magnitude of the effect, the negative effect of depression severity on memory and executive functioning. So I've defined memory, but executive functioning is dependent on the prefrontal cortex, and it's associated with things like inhibition, flexible thinking, monitoring your task goals, like what am I doing, planning, that sort of thing. In these data, we find that the negative impact of depression on executive functioning and memory is exacerbated with age. This is another double jeopardy effect. And I'll just mention this here, but not go into details. But basically, we do find this for neutral emotional events, but there's actually a relative sparing of memory with depression for negative emotional events. And that's been shown in the literature, too. And I'm not going to really talk more about that. I just want to point that out. So in collaboration with Dr. Dotson, we've developed an executive dysfunction theory of episodic memory impairments and this double jeopardy with age. And the reason we think that the reason we developed this framework is because executive dysfunction is a primary contributor to episodic memory impairments in cognitively unimpaired aging. So when memory impairments are seen in older people, they tend to be most evident when the demands on inhibition and monitoring of what you've recovered in memory are high. We've shown that a lot. Executive dysfunction is also a likely contributor to emotion regulation deficits in depression. So in studies of major depression, it's also well known that people have trouble regulating their negative emotions. They tend to rely on something called suppression, where it's like shut down the negative response, and actually that breeds greater depression. And so executive dysfunction is thought to underlie that difficulty with emotion regulation. And we also know that there are similar brain regions, primarily in the prefrontal cortex, that underlie executive functioning, emotion regulation, and age-related episodic memory impairment. So therein lies the rationale for our theory. So racial and ethnic minorities are very underrepresented in effective neuroscience, emotional neuroscience work. And this is really important because emerging work from epidemiological studies suggests that although diagnosed depression is less common in racial and ethnic minorities, when depressive symptoms are observed, they seem to be associated with worse cognitive performance, more debilitating cognitive and health outcomes. So how depressive symptoms and age interact in these historically minoritized adults is virtually unknown. And so in a new grant, a new project with Allie Clark and Vanetta, we're exploring this double jeopardy effect in a diverse sample of people across the adult lifespan. And we have some new findings that are consistent with our executive functioning and double jeopardy framework, where we find that age exacerbates depression-related executive dysfunction, where here on the scale, a higher number is worse executive functioning. And if people have higher levels of depression, which is this, teal, whatever that color is. I'm regretting these color choices, but worse executive functioning and higher age is associated with greater depression severity, or I said that in a weird way, but we're seeing a double jeopardy effect in the Black and Mexican American middle-aged adults that we measured that we assessed in this study. We don't see the relationship in the non-Hispanic white participants. And we're also looking here at brain volume, and this is a region called the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, which is a principal area involved in executive functioning, but also emotion regulation. It also shows volume reductions and functional integrity loss with age. And so here we see that the volume of this region is reduced with increasing age, right? Lower volume with increasing age, and depression in middle-aged Black and Mexican Americans, but not the non-Hispanic whites, which I'm not showing. Non-Hispanic white adults, which I'm not showing here. So what we're doing in our new project is following people longitudinally to identify the combination of mood, health, and brain health factors that are most predictive of cognitive decline and rates of decline in these different groups. Okay, so a big question we have is, why is the effect stronger for racial and ethnic minorities? And we don't know from these data alone. Okay, the ones I just presented. But it's some likely possibilities include things like vascular disease, which we know is higher in these minoritized groups like Black adults and Mexican adults. So for example, using MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, we can measure something called white matter hyperintensities, which are indicative of demyelination, axon loss, just loss of neural integrity. Okay. And the white matter hyperintensities are the hyper-intense white bright spots where more is worse. White matter hyperintensities are worse. And this burden of white matter hyperintensities is clinically important to measure because it's associated with an increased risk of stroke. So if you can measure it times 0, a higher burden is predictive of a higher rate of stroke, brain atrophy, cognitive decline, and dementia. And importantly, white matter hyperintensities are precipitated by the presence of malleable factors, including hypertension, smoking, and diabetes, which are more prevalent in these historically minoritized groups. And again, I'll make the point here that these risk factors are also more prevalent due to, in part, racial and ethnic disparities in access to quality health care. So we have found a disproportionate impact of white matter burden, or it's a measure of vascular integrity, a greater prevalence of vascular disease, i.e. white matter hyperintensities, is associated with a higher depression score, particularly in Black participants. And this is in the prefrontal cortex. I'll mention that here. So kind of some evidence of this double jeopardy that we're seeing, and vascular burden may be one of those factors underlying this double jeopardy that I was talking about. So in the work that we're doing now, which is longitudinal, we're investigating things like vascular disease with structural brain imaging and other race-related proxy factors to see to what extent they explain depression-related memory impairment, particularly in Black and Mexican adults. So this is like putting it all together, okay? So in trying to understand the best predictors of episodic memory performance and decline in diverse adult populations, we've focused on habitual sleep quality and quantity, mood, like depression, and emotion regulation. We've explored vascular health, and then all of these, importantly, are intervention targets, right? It's much potentially easier to intervene on something like sleep than it is on neural mechanisms or some other factors like structural racism is very difficult to intervene on. It's a huge factor, but we're thinking about these as potentially malleable targets that, like, for example, vascular health. Let's say we find vascular integrity is a greater predictor of cognitive impairment and decline in some participants. Maybe our historically minoritized participants. We can induce an intervention that's exercise related, some kind of physical activity related, or maybe dietary interventions. They may be particularly important. It's kind of a precision medicine type of approach. We also explore the neural mechanisms of memory, and why we do that is, one, basic science. We're interested in understanding what's underlying memory and all of these relationships. But also with understanding neural mechanisms, you can identify targets of brain stimulation methods. So there are methods like transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is non-invasive, and you can stimulate particular brain areas. And that has been shown, for example, in emotion regulation studies. You can stimulate and improve emotion regulation, just as an example, or sleep, actually. And then psychosocial factors that might explain some of these disparities that we're seeing. Perceived discrimination. I didn't get to talk about the culture work that we're doing, but acculturation and related stress. So this would be particularly relevant, for example, for our Mexican-American participants. In a new project with my collaborator, Angela Gutches, who's a cross-cultural psychology researcher, we're exploring how one's heritage culture and one's affiliation with that heritage culture in Mexican-American and Chinese-American participants influences what they're likely to remember. And we're excited about that because all the work that's been done on memory strategies has not examined culture. And if we can find culturally specific kinds of strategies that would be useful, there's a lot of potential there. So and that's non-invasive, and we're very excited. And then other factors that are more, we think, are buffers, like religiosity and social support. So I'll just end by thanking you all, and also all my lab and my collaborators, like Dr. Yo, who makes those amazing wearable electronics. Limarie Trotty, she's a sleep neurologist, and she's a advisor and collaborator in all the sleep work. Vanetta Dotson, who I mentioned. Allie Clark and Andriana Haley, who are here, and collaborators on like the depression work I showed you, and then Angela Gutches, who's a collaborator on the culture work I didn't get to show you, but wanted to acknowledge her anyway. Thanks so much. It feels like I'm drinking flat soda. Does anyone else have that? It's a very weird sensation.
Thank you so much for that wonderful talk. We have a few minutes for questions, if anyone wants to pose something to Dr. Duarte.
Hi. Oh God, I hate this. Okay.
We're all watching you.
Great. Love it so much. I'm so excited. Thank you for this talk. This was really cool. I have some questions about the religiosity as a buffer.
Sure.
So I was curious if you think it's like just being more religious and having that connection with spirituality that's kind of providing or pushing that buffer, or if it's being more associated with a group and having that support in that organization.
That's a really good question. So I will say in that study we also measured social support, and it's how many close people do you have in your life? I forget the wording of the question, but basically like people you can lean on. And there was a correlation with religiosity, but it wasn't a super strong correlation. And social support showed a similar kind of buffering effect. So we think that they are, there's some relationship there, but we're not measuring one and the same thing. I think they're different constructs. Both could offer emotion regulation, enhancements, but social support might give other things too, right? So perspective and that sort of thing, but actually both. So yeah, it's a good question, but yeah.
Anyone else?
Here we go.
Students.
They just had to get warmed up. I'm really warm. It's really hot up here.
Oh wow, that's on. So mine's kind of going off the religiosity question. So I kind of want to hear more about the cultural piece, just because we know that, particularly in like Black families in the South or Latino families, religion can play a really important role. And so I'm kind of curious what do you think you're going to find considering religiosity in these groups?
Yeah, I only know from the data that we have so far, right? So that buffering effect of religiosity we've seen across different racial and ethnic groups, but there is greater religiosity, and we found this too in the, that was a study of Black adults across the lifespan. Across age, the Black participants were higher in all levels of religiosity than the non-Hispanic white participants. So it's a good question. I don't know if it would be a stronger buffering factor in one group or another. It seems to be a buffering factor across the groups so far that we've measured, but it's really just so early in days. Do you have an idea about how it would interact with the different racial ethnic groups?
No. I would assume that it would also maybe have a stronger buffering effect for Black and Latinx.
Yeah, yeah.
But also, I'm considering how it might also consider different cultural aspects of these groups.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, it's not my area of study, but it's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it's not my super area of expertise either, but well, anyway, I'm going to go on a tangent. That's something I want to do, is they know, so I'm going to not do that.
Hi, my question is more so about the methods and measures.
Sure.
So you mentioned at some point that the CESDR is validated across groups. And with the tigraphy, I'm assuming that's just like recording movement and all that. So I'm not really concerned about that. But I'm more so of like, I guess you mentioned that at some point there's activities about like memory and kind of like capturing that. And so my question is like, how appropriate is that for like non-English speaking participants? Because you might be given a task of like, say these words, but they may not even understand what they mean, or, kind of like along those lines.
Yeah, I probably should have clarified. So all the participants, and because of the language, the English language, component of the task, all the participants are fluent English speakers. They're not all native English speakers, and we didn't explore that. However, in the culture work, we are interested in that. We're interested in language usage. So the second generation subjects are going to vary in the extent to which they use their heritage language or both languages equally, or whatever. And we are exploring that as a factor underlying what they remember. We are doing a study now to verify that people are familiar with the words. But we are finding, is Audrey here? No, she's doing it. And one of my students, we are finding some differences where people aren't as familiar with a word that we would have thought they would be. But it's one of the factors that we're interested in exploring is, are people more likely to remember, for example, words that are positive emotional words, because there are these well-known differences in where Latinos tend to, in rating positive emotions or exhibiting emotions, tend to be more expressive, and particularly for positive emotional events. But so we're interested in exploring that further. I'm not sure if that answered the question you have, but yeah. But they were all fluent in English in this study so far.
Thank you for your presentation. It was great. I really liked how you were talking about the development of the mailable sleep sensor and how that increases accessibility for diverse populations.
Yeah.
I'm also wondering if you have any thing to say about engaging diverse communities, and I think there's historical injustices within science, and so I think accessibility is definitely one component. But if you have any words to say about how we can really engage those communities for the future of research.
That is a really good and big question. I would say that it's like a multifaceted sort of, one must take a multifaceted approach, right? I can talk, so I've been at UT Austin for 3 years, but I was at Georgia Tech and Atlanta for longer, 13 years. And so there, most of our participants that we were, from our historically minoritized participants were Black. And I lost you. Oh, yeah. So in Atlanta, we were battling this legacy of the university previously being segregated and the city being very segregated, right, the segregated South. And so it took us a lot of, I don't know if I'm saying anything that's helpful, but we did a lot of community-based outreach. We would just go and talk to people. We would go to church events. We would go to cookouts. And not for the purposes of like, please sign up for our study, but just kind of breaking down barriers and letting people kind of hear about what we're doing. And some were interested and some were like, I'll take your, pens and then bye. And that's fine, But through that and kind of building trust, that's how we accrued our participants, and then I think kind of seeing that we really care about this and we're really interested, and this is not a coercion thing, but we're going to compensate you for the time that you're, that wasn't always the case. Some people were just in studies, that they didn't know the details of and weren't compensated. In fact, they were damaged by some of those studies. So there was a lot to overcome. But I mean, basically getting out, the ways that we tend to rely on for recruitment are not effective. We do a lot of mailing letters to people. People really like to get letters in the mail. And we found that to be extremely effective. Radio ads have been helpful, particularly with Latinos. So yeah, I don't know if that was what you're asking about, but
Much.
yeah, sure.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Are there any more questions? Oh, there's an online question.
Oh, I thought you had a question. I was like, sure.
All right. I have a question from Patrick Davison, who asks, how do sex and gender fit in the picture?
Yeah, I kind of dropped that element completely. That is a great question. So for the data that we have, with the outcomes that I mentioned, we haven't seen, I don't know where to look for this. I'm looking at my computer, which is weird. We haven't seen an influence of sex and gender. There are things that do differ, right? So, well, I will say levels of depression, prevalence of depression is well known to differ by sex and gender, and sleep quality also is worse in our female participants than our male participants. The relationship so far between sleep, let's say, depression, and the cognitive outcomes, that doesn't seem to differ so far, but it is one of our factors to explore.
He gave a thumbs up.
Oh, good. Hi, Patrick.
Hello. Okay.
Yeah.
For you, something I was really curious about was you mentioned that religiosity helped with emotional regulation. I was wondering what your thoughts would be on the relationship between religiosity helping emotional regulation, and how that relationship might change as a function of years of residency in the U.S. or acculturation in Latinos.
Such a good question. Okay. Big one. Where do I start with it? It's a great question. For the religiosity, I don't think we know. I don't want to say no one's done that, because there's someone on Zoom maybe who's done it. But I don't think that's well known how that differs with age. Time in the U.S., there has been work in this area with many kind of psychosocial factors, for example. I would say the literature, and there are people in this room that are better equipped to answer this question than I am, but from what I remember from the literature I've read, time in the U.S., and this is complicated by different groups too, is worse. I know that's a dumb way to kind of characterize it. Yeah. And that can differ based on where you work. What are the demographics of the people around you? There's some research in younger people, and not just younger people, but faculty at universities where they are one of the few racial ethnic minorities having higher levels of race-related stress. So I think that kind of got away from your question about religiosity, but I think that's an interesting question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. We are out of time, but we really appreciate you giving this wonderful talk, and congratulations again. And
Thank you.
thank you, everyone.